Hello everyone and very welcome back to my channel English Story with Ella. In this channel you can learn English through the story. At the end of each story you have some questions about it. If you can understand it completely, you can answer all the questions. The mystery of the missing necklace. Once upon a time in a small town there was a beautiful necklace. It was made of gold and had a big shiny diamond in the middle. The necklace belonged to Mrs. Green, a kind old lady who lived in a small house with a garden full of flowers. One sunny day, Mrs. Green decided to wear her necklace to the market. She loved to show it to her friends. "Look at my beautiful necklace," she said with a smile. Everyone admired it. "It is so pretty, Mrs. Green," they said. After shopping, Mrs. Green went back home. She took off the necklace and put it on her table. "I will wear it again tomorrow," she thought happily. But when she woke up the next morning, she saw that the necklace was gone. "Oh no, where is my necklace?" she cried. Mrs. Green looked everywhere in her house. She checked under the bed, in the kitchen, and even in her garden. But the necklace was not there. She was very sad. "I must find my necklace," she said. So she called her neighbor, Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was a detective. He loved solving mysteries. "Don't worry, Mrs. Green," he said. "I will help you find your necklace." He took out his notebook and asked, "Who was here yesterday?" Mrs. Green thought for a moment. "My friend, Mrs. White, came to visit me," she said. "And I saw Mr. Black in the market." Mr. Brown wrote down the names in his notebook. "Let's talk to Mrs. White first," he said. They went to Mrs. White's house. She was sitting on her porch, drinking tea. "Hello, Mrs. Green. Hello, Mr. Brown," she said cheerfully. "What brings you here?" "Mrs. White, did you see my necklace yesterday?" asked Mrs. Green. Mrs. White shook her head. "No, I didn't see it," she said. "But I heard that Mr. Black was acting strangely in the market." "Strangely?" Mr. Brown asked. "Yes," replied Mrs. White. "He was looking around and seemed nervous." Mr. Brown wrote this down too. "Thank you, Mrs. White," he said. "We will talk to Mr. Black now." They walked to Mr. Black's house. When they arrived, Mr. Black was watering his plants in the garden. He looked surprised to see them. "Hello? What can I do for you?" he asked. "Mr. Black, did you see Mrs. Green's necklace yesterday?" Mr. Brown asked. Mr. Black frowned and said, "No, I didn't see it." But Mr. Brown noticed that Mr. Black's hands were dirty and had some sparkles on them. "Why are your hands dirty?" Mr. Brown asked. "I was working in my garden," Mr. Black replied quickly. Mrs. Green looked at Mr. Black's hands closely and saw something shining between his fingers. "What is that?" she asked. Mr. Black looked worried now. It's just dirt, he said nervously. Mr. Brown decided to ask more questions. Mr. Black, did you go to the market yesterday? Yes, I did, Mr. Black admitted. Did you see anyone there? Mr. Brown continued. I saw many people, Mr. Black replied. Mr. Brown thought for a moment and then asked, did you see Mrs. Green? No, I didn't see her, Mr. Black said quickly. Mr. Brown felt something was wrong with Mr. Black's answer. Can we see your hands again? He asked. Mr. Black hesitated, but then showed his hands again. The sparkles were still there. These sparkles looked like diamonds, said Mrs. Green with wide eyes. Mr. Black looked very nervous now and started to sit. Mr. Black, Mr. Brown said firmly, I think you know where the necklace is. I don't have it, Mr. Black shouted. But then suddenly Max, Mrs. Green's dog, ran into the garden, barking loudly, and jumped up at Mr. Black's leg. Max, stop! Shouted Mrs. Green. But Max kept barking and sniffing at Mrs. Black's hands. Why is your dog so interested in you? Asked Mr. Brown. Max kept barking and finally found something shiny near Mr. Black's feet. It was Mrs. Green's necklace. Look! Shouted Mrs. Green as she pointed to the necklace on the ground. Mr. Brown picked it up and said, Mr. Black, why did you take this? I I wanted to borrow it, he stammered. You should have asked, said Mrs. Green angrily. Mr. Brown said, you must return it right now. Mr. Black looked ashamed and gave the necklace back to Mrs. Green. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Mrs. Green smiled again as she put the necklace around her neck once more. Thank you for helping me find my necklace, Mr. Brown, she said happily. You're welcome, replied Mr. Brown with a smile. From that day on, Mr. Black learned to ask before borrowing things from others, and Mrs. Green always kept her beautiful necklace safe at home. Thank you very much, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this story. Now answer the question about it. Number 1. What did Mrs. Green lose? A book, a necklace, a dog. Yes, a necklace. Number 2. Who helped Mrs. Green find her necklace? Her son, Mr. Brown, Mrs. White. Very good. He was Mr. Brown. Number 3. What was strange about Mr. Black? He was happy. He had dirty hands with sparkles. He was sleeping. Yes, is number 2. He had dirty hands with sparkles. Number 4. Who barked and found the necklace? A cat, Max, the dog, a bird. Yes, very good, guys. Max, the dog. And the last one, number 5. What did Mr. Black learn at the end of the story? To never go to the market again? To ask before borrowing something? To buy a new necklace? Yes, great. To ask before borrowing something. Listen carefully to the statement and choose true or false. Number 1. Mrs. Green lived alone in her house. Yes, it's false. Number 2. Mr. Brown is a detective. Yes, it was true. Number 3. The necklace was found in Mr. Brown's pocket. No, it is false. Number 4. Max is Mrs. Green's cat. No, it's false. Max was a dog. And number 5, the last question. Mr. Black took the necklace because he wanted to borrow it. Yes, very good. It was true. Don't forget to subscribe my channel, like me and hit the bell.